Greetings, everyone. A very warm welcome to you all to this webinar hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, also called the NC-CASC, or the North Central CASC, which is based at the University of Colorado, Boulder. This is our first webinar of the Spring 2023 series, and we have some great presentations lined up for this series. I'm Imtiaz Rangwala, Climate Science Lead at the North Central CASC, co-hosting this webinar with my colleague Heather Yoakum, who is our Social Science Lead. We bring you these webinars to facilitate a discussion of science, research, and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate, with a focus on the North Central US that encompasses the Missouri and the Upper Colorado River basins. Before I introduce our speaker, a quick word on housekeeping. We are recording this webinar, and you can find all our webinar recordings on our website. During the webinar, all participants will be muted, but you will have the ability to unmute during the Q&A period at the end. We, however, encourage you to put your questions and comments in the chat box anytime during the webinar. And we will start with those questions first during the Q&A in the order they are received. We will end the formal part of this presentation at noon Mountain Time and stop the recording at that point. After that, anyone who wishes to stay on to engage in a more informal conversation with our speaker is encouraged to do so. And now I'm very delighted to introduce Dr. Wynn Moss, our speaker for today. Wynn is an ecologist and a conservation biologist interested in how wild populations respond to environmental stresses, including land use transformation, climate change, and infectious disease. She's currently a biologist with the USGS Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center. Previously, she worked as a postdoctoral scientist with Conservation Science Partners, which is a North Central CASC affiliate. Her postdoctoral research, funded by the National CASC, used collaborative science synthesis to better understand the potential for drought to trigger ecological transformation, which we will hear all about today. Wynn has a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of Colorado Boulder. Her dissertation work examined the interactions between amphibians and the concurrent threats of drought, infectious disease, and invasive species. She holds a master's in wildlife ecology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where her research focused on the behavioral responses of mountain lions to increasing urbanization. Her talk today is titled The Increasing Role of Drought in Ecological Transformation. Thank you, Wynn, for presenting to us today, and please take it away.
Thanks, Imtiaz. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. Yeah, and thank you to the North Central CASC for having me talk today and for kind of helping host me as a postdoc. So what I'm talking about today is work that I did during my postdoc last year with Conservation Science Partners. As of November, I'm now at USGS, and I'll mention that this work was done with Shelley Crosby and Imtiaz Rangwala as co-PIs. Shelley was also previously at Conservation Science Partners and is now at the Forest Service. And of course, Imtiaz, who you all just met, is representing the North Central CASC. So everything I'm going to talk about today is part of this science synthesis effort that was done with a pretty large working group of folks who you see here. So there's 15 other co-authors on this presentation. And what I'm going to share today is less of a typical science talk and more of a conceptual overview of all the different ways that drought might be expected to cause long-lasting changes in ecosystems. And we're talking about changes that last far beyond the duration of a single drought. Okay. So I'll mention that this project was funded by the National Climate Adaptation Science Center with additional support from the University of Colorado, the North Central CASC, and Conservation Science Partners. For this talk today, I'm going to start by introducing the idea of ecological transformation, and I'm going to hone in on drought as a really important driver of transformation under a changing climate. I'm going to talk a little bit about how our group approached understanding this phenomenon using science synthesis. And then last, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about some of the mechanisms by which droughts can cause transformation. And I'll try to work in some examples that are relevant to the North Central region. So the idea of ecological transformation, it's been defined and measured in a number of different ways, but you can think of it as the rearrangement of ecological communities, changes in dominant vegetation type, or shifts in a stable state. These are all kind of ways of getting at the same thing, which is a dramatic and irreversible shift in the ecological characteristics of a system. And what that's really driven by is a high degree of turnover in the species that are there. So you're getting shifts in the ecological communities, and that has all sorts of cascading effects. And what's key about ecological transformation is we're not talking about subtle or temporary changes. We're not talking about fluctuations in the relative abundances of species from year to year. And we're not even talking about big changes that then are followed by recovery. But what we're really talking about is persistent changes that impact important functions of ecosystems. And we want to think about these separately because they require management adaptation. And so ecological transformation can be triggered by a lot of different drivers: land use change, nutrient deposition, fire. Here's an example of transformation due to invasions. So when cheatgrass invades a sagebrush ecosystem, it causes shifts in all sorts of things like carbon cycling, biodiversity, fire regimes. And what's important is that those changes are really difficult to reverse. And of course, a lot of us now think of climate change as being one of the biggest drivers of transformation. This plot here on the left comes from a paper that forecasted the probability of transformation just due to temperature increases under 2 different emission scenarios. And you can see that the probability of transformation is pretty high all across the globe just due to a warming climate. So one point I want to make is that it's not just changes in the mean climate conditions that can cause transformations, but extreme events like droughts, heat waves, or floods, those can also be really important instigators of transformation. And the effect of extremes is particularly powerful when it's combined with longer-term stressors like climate change. So what we're seeing now, and we can expect to see more of in the coming decades, is climate extremes are happening more frequently and they're getting more and more extreme. And at the same time, mean climate conditions are shifting through time. So we might think about measuring the ecological response to that. Maybe we want to measure something like biodiversity or productivity. And what we know is that systems can be pretty resistant to an extreme, so they can not show much of a response. Or they can be resilient, meaning they do show a response, but they pretty quickly recover. And of course, ecosystems have all sorts of mechanisms for resistance and resilience, and that's why many ecosystem forms have stuck around for thousands and thousands of years. But what we're increasingly seeing is that when you overlay an extreme on top of this long-term stressor, is you're pushing systems beyond that capacity to resist or to be resilient. And so we're seeing both larger responses to extremes, so that's declining resistance, and we're seeing systems take longer time to recover, which is decreasing resilience. And unlike this slow reorganization that's happening as species shift their ranges in response to climate, the changes that happen after extreme events can be particularly abrupt, and that makes them really challenging to prepare for and respond to. So instead of having a new community by mid-century, after the mean climate has already shifted by 2 or 3 degrees, you might be talking about having a new ecological community after the next big event, which could happen this year or next year. And so what we really don't want is for these transformations to catch us by surprise. And that was one of the ideas that really motivated this work. And another idea that motivated this work is this big body of research that's investigating the ecological impacts of drought and trying to separate those out from the socioeconomic or the agricultural impacts of drought. And of course, drought has all sorts of impacts on ecosystems. It affects aquatic and terrestrial system. It affects plants and animals. It changes all sorts of ecosystem functions. But one thing that ecological drought research hasn't always done is distinguish between impacts that are transient and eventually subside and those that are long lasting and lead to transformation. So a lot of research might publish a paper on, the impact of a recent drought, but they don't really tell you what happens 5 years down the road after that drought. And this paper I'm showing here they interviewed a bunch of drought scientists and managers and decision makers, and they asked them what some of the emergent challenges are in understanding ecological drought. And one of the key themes that jumped out was we really need to understand these longer term transformational impacts and how they happen. So that was really the goal of our science synthesis project that I'm presenting today. So what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this seminar is the idea of transformational ecological droughts, or I'm going to abbreviate these as TEDs. And these are extreme and persistent changes in ecological communities that are initiated or promoted by drought. So you can think of this as a subset of ecological transformations where drought is really a key driver. So my co-authors and I, we just recently wrote this paper where we put forth a definition for this phenomenon. But I want to emphasize that even though we're kind of proposing this new definition, the idea and the phenomenon of TED is not at all new. In fact, we've been seeing examples of it in the paleo record for many thousands of years, including this example I'm showing from the Northeast. And so at this site in the Northeast, these scientists reconstructed drought using water table depth. They reconstructed a fire record, and they looked at compositional changes in the forest using a pollen record. And you can see that when there was this period of drought combined with a fire, you saw a big shift in the forest composition at this site. You saw declines in the dominant species, which was hemlock and beech, and you saw subsequent increases in pines and oaks. And you can imagine that's going to have all sorts of downstream effects on this forest ecosystem. And what's really key here is that after conditions return to normal, you don't see these communities return to their previous state. And this was a transformation that lasted for centuries all the way up until European settlement. This is what we're talking about when we talk about drought causing a stable and persistent shift in ecological communities. And a more modern example that's pretty well known comes from the US Southwest, where there's been repeated instances of mass die-offs in pinyon pines in response to drought, particularly a drought in the early 2000s. And that caused a shift in these woodland systems towards being dominated by junipers, and in some cases being co-dominated by invasive grasses. And in many locations where this has happened, even 2 decades after the drought, we're not seeing any recovery of pinyon pines. So as I'm going to be talking about today, these contemporary examples are mounting. And as this evidence rolls in, we wanted to think about a synthesis of these kinds of changes, where they're occurring, and what's happening that makes a drought lead to an ecosystem transformation. So what we set out to do is describe very broadly what happens when drought causes a shift to a new ecosystem state. And we figured that this was going to involve knowledge from a lot of different disciplines. So what Shelley and Imtiaz and I did next is assemble a group of scientists that work across these really broad scientific topics. There were 18 of us in total, and we had expertise ranging from climatology to plant physiology to community and disturbance ecology. And folks in this group work across a wide range of ecosystems and all across the US. We also asked some experts in drought planning and adaptation to serve in an advisory capacity to help us think about how to make our science relevant to people that are actually making decisions about how to prepare for drought. And as a reward for their participation, each of these folks was gifted with a custom cartoon portrait. If you know any of these people, you can kind of decide how close that resemblance is. We also hired 2 facilitators to help us. Stacy Lishka, who's a social scientist and a facilitator, and Angie Moline, who's an ecologist and a graphical facilitator. And what these 2 did is they really helped us think about how to connect, especially on Zoom, and how to get everyone to participate, how to think outside the box and think creatively. And we knew that those were really important components for tackling a really complicated question and a really interdisciplinary question. So Angie Moline, who's this graphic facilitator, did all sorts of really cool doodles for us as we talked about the science. And that ended up being a really important way to represent interactions among processes and to gather and build upon people's ideas. And so I mention all this just because I think science synthesis and collaborative science are becoming really important parts of our toolkit for understanding problems like global change, which are these big, thorny, interdisciplinary problems. And so I wanted to share a little bit about our approach and also acknowledge that the work I'm presenting is really a team effort. And what we tried to do as a group is to write a synthesis paper and synthesize existing science to talk about how droughts can cause ecological transformation, and hopefully do it in a way that is a little bit less about ecological theory and a little bit more about specific mechanisms that we could think about measuring or targeting with management strategies. So we set out to first find some examples of where TEDs or transformational ecological droughts have already happened or seem to be happening, and to look across pretty diverse ecosystems and think about whether they tend to share any particular characteristics. Then we came up with a list of important mechanisms and what the current state of the science was about each mechanism, and to try and link that with relevant management strategies. And then lastly, we wanted this paper that we wrote to communicate about why the risk of transformations might be expected to increase in the coming decades. So I'm going to devote the rest of this talk to sharing the main results of that synthesis work. And so because this is a synthesis of existing research, I'm not going to be showing you any new data, but I am going to be highlighting some examples of science that really help us understand drought and transformation. And I'll just mention that I'm mostly going to be talking about terrestrial systems and how they're changing in terms of the dominant vegetation. But there's definitely examples of aquatic systems that are shifting, and other ways you might measure transformation. So you can think about how this work might extend to those other systems. Okay, so the first thing we did is we combed through the literature to try to find examples of where drought triggered a dramatic compositional shift. So a change in the dominant vegetation, and where that shift seemed like it was stable. And so here I'm just showing 12 examples of case studies that we found that kind of capture some geographic and ecological diversity. And so the first thing you can see is that droughts have caused ecological transformations across a pretty big aridity gradient. So it's happening in both wet and dry places, and it's happening across latitudes in both temperate and tropical ecosystems. So, our first finding is that lots of ecosystems can experience transformations from drought. It's not just something that happens in arid systems. And in terms of what was going on in these case studies, in some of these cases, drought alone or repeated droughts alone caused that shift. And in many other cases, drought caused a transformation because it was interacting with other stressors like fires or disease. And so there were a lot of different potential combinations of mechanisms that were involved in situations where transformation happened. So before I get into those mechanisms, I just want to highlight a few of these examples so you can see what I'm talking about. So in interior Alaska, forests that have typically been dominated by black spruce are now starting to be replaced by deciduous species like birch or aspen. And that's happening as droughts become more frequent and hotter, and as they interact with changes to the fire regime. In Southern Europe, there's been many different examples where forests that are dominated by Scotch pine are turning into something closer to an oak woodland, which is a pretty big change in ecosystem form. Some of that's due to just more severe and hotter droughts, and some of it's due to drought interacting with pathogen attack. This is not just something that happens in coniferous forests. So from the US Southeast, we're also seeing that salt marsh ecosystems, which are typically dominated by cordgrass, in many cases, those are getting completely devegetated and turning into mudflats after a drought. And in many locations across the Southeast, they don't seem to be recovering. And that transformation involves some interesting shifts in interactions among species, including how drought shifts interactions between cordgrass and herbivores, and between cordgrass and some of their mutualist species. So again, there's a lot of different pathways and outcomes of transformational ecological drought. So as a working group, we spent a lot of time thinking about what kind of mechanisms were involved in these events and how they relate to one another. And we tried to arrange these into a conceptual model. So like most conceptual models, this is an oversimplification, but it really helped us organize the science and think about how feedbacks and interactions might arise. So I'm going to walk you through our model of how drought might lead to ecological transformation. So first, during a transformational drought, some kind of drought, whether it's a precipitation anomaly or a period of high evaporative demand, leads to a deficit in the amount of water that's available to organisms. And that process is modified by all sorts of things. You know, how humans are using water, how the landscape distributes water, you know, how we've historically managed land and what the land cover type is. All of these are going to modify where water is available to organisms and how drought is perceived by these organisms. And so for this process to lead to transformation, it needs to impact species composition. And so it needs to affect the relative abundances of species. And it does that by affecting population growth rates, by changing either recruitment or mortality rates. And changes in those rates lead to shifts in species composition. And so sometimes that happens through this kind of direct physiological mechanisms. Organisms are stressed, and so they, you know, they suffer higher mortality or lower recruitment. But sometimes it happens through some other disturbance, like drought increases the likelihood of beetle attack or fire. And those can also impact recruitment and mortality. And sometimes for this to really become severe enough to cause a transformation, it might need to happen in the context of some other disturbance that might not even be related to drought, like habitat fragmentation or a previous invasion. These things can make it a lot harder for ecosystems to respond and recover from a drought. And of course, all of this is happening now in a novel climate context, and that impacts pretty much every facet of this. It impacts how drought manifests, how we use water, the likelihood of some of these other disturbances. And so climate context is really a key part of this entire pathway. So species population growth rates are changing. We get compositional shifts in who's there in a community, and the makeup of an ecosystem starts to change. And depending on how stable that is, we can get transformation or we might get recovery. And what often makes this stable and leads to transformation is that these compositional shifts are reinforced by feedbacks among mechanisms. And I'm only showing a few of those possible feedbacks here. So now we have our conceptual map of how drought can lead to transformation. And what we tried to think about next is what might be happening in the next few decades that might change these mechanisms and make transformation more likely. The one thing that is really clear is that the likelihood of drought causing transformation is shifting in a big way because the very nature of drought itself is shifting in a big way. And that's just due to drought occurring in a really new climate context. So what I'm showing here are some maps that were made by Imtiaz Rangwala that use a global climate model to look at how drought might manifest by mid-century. So these maps are showing basically how much more frequent extremes are going to be compared to a historic period. And so when you look at annual precipitation, you can see that many places are actually going to have more extreme wet conditions. They're going to get wetter over the next 50 years. But when you look at soil moisture deficit, the future looks quite a bit drier. And when you look at evaporative demand, you see that nearly everywhere on Earth is going to face a future with a drier atmosphere. And that's, of course, because it's getting a lot warmer and the relationship between temperature and evaporative demand is really strong. So what that means for droughts is that under future climate regimes, droughts are often going to manifest as a dry atmosphere combined with dry soil and heat stress. And that really represents a triple whammy for plants. It's really hard to cope with something like heat stress if there's no water in the soil, for example. And so many of the mass mortality events that have happened in the past few decades, like aspen die-offs here in the Western US, they haven't happened necessarily during a huge precipitation deficit, but they've happened when a somewhat routine precipitation deficit is coupled with really warm temperatures, which leads to really high atmospheric demand. And so that's kind of what the future of many of our droughts are going to look like and why they're so stressful for plant communities. So in addition to these hotter droughts, there's other forms of unfamiliar drought that ecosystems are now experiencing. One that's pretty relevant for temperate ecosystems, like in the North Central region, is a shift in the form of precipitation during winter. So instead of getting precipitation falling as snow, we're increasingly having it fall as rain, and that really shifts the timing of when water is available to organisms, and it can cause really high drought stress during the spring and summer. So even though we might think of species or communities as being pretty resilient to typical droughts, they may have even stronger responses to some of these unfamiliar forms of drought that we know are increasing from climate change and other anthropogenic impacts. So the first big point I want to make is that droughts are more likely to lead to transformation because they're becoming more frequent, and they're a lot different than the types of droughts that organisms have experienced in the past. So when we think about how bad a drought is going to be for organisms, it's really not just about how severe the drought itself is. So how we quantify vapor pressure deficit or precipitation deficit. What really matters is how that drought is experienced by an organism. And the way that we link an organismal response to these atmospheric or the meteorological drought conditions is through the concept of ecologically available water, which Amanda Cravens has defined really nicely here as the quantity, timing, and quality of water available to ecosystems, considering all of the incoming and outgoing processes. So what that means is that some locations are going to be more or less affected by the same drought because of their ability to maintain ecologically available water. So for example, you might think of a hydrologic refugia on a landscape that stays wetter longer during a drought, maybe because it has a deeper groundwater pool or it has differences in evaporation rates. And that also means that the ways that humans shift ecologically available water by maybe reducing groundwater or changing runoff, those activities really alter the way that organisms experience drought, and often for the worst. So not only is drought itself changing, but even the same droughts might be felt differently by organisms today because of how we're shifting the distribution of water. So often these transformation events begin with a really big mass mortality event during a drought. And so we want to think about how drought actually leads to plant mortality. And first, there's kind of this direct physiological route. As the soil and as the air get drier, plants can undergo something called hydraulic failure, where they get air bubbles or embolisms in their tissues and they die from the inability to transport water and other nutrients. And so a lot of people have spent a lot of time measuring the plant traits that govern how quickly this happens under water stress. And it differs strongly among species, and that has helped us understand quite a bit about different species' drought tolerance and start to think about what species might be more or less sensitive. But it turns out when you try to use those traits to predict exactly which species in an ecosystem are going to die from drought, or where on the landscape drought is going to cause mass mortality, you don't always get it right. And that's because the identity of a plant and how it transports water is just one piece of the equation. A plant's likelihood of dying from drought is affected by a whole bunch of other processes that control water availability. So for example, we know that forest management and its impact on forest density is really, really important. Trees that we think of as maybe being pretty insensitive to drought can become a lot more sensitive if they're competing with many other individuals for water. And so mortality often ends up being much higher where density is high. So a lot of work has shown that activities like fire suppression or forest thinning, they really shape where mortality happens and whether or not drought has these big impacts. And so these management activities are super important tools for mitigating the impacts of drought. So mortality can happen through this kind of direct physiological route, but it also can happen when drought alters the likelihood of other disturbances like beetles or fire. And these are often the actual reasons why you have mass mortality events after drought, and also the reason why plant traits related to drought physiology don't always help us understand their response to drought. So all of these interactions really modify how quickly and where a drought is going to lead to a big mortality event. And they tell us why the risk of TED might be expected to increase. It's not that plant traits are shifting, making them more susceptible to drought, but it's us kind of changing these different features. We're changing the hydrology of systems. We're managing landscapes in ways that can increase competition. We're moving species and pathogens around, and our fires are becoming more severe. So all of these things make it increasingly likely that drought might lead to a mortality event. And these are also really important levers that managers can think about pulling in order to shape the evolution of these transformational droughts. Okay, so where do we see these big mortality events actually happening? At least in trees, which have received a lot of study, the answer is that it's really happened all over, including in some pretty wet systems like rainforests. And one of the reasons that this has tended to happen in many different ecosystems is that lots of plant species have a pretty narrow safety margin. And that safety margin is basically the difference in the typical water availability in natural conditions and the water availability that would cause hydraulic failure. And so what that means is that even a small change in water availability from a not super severe drought could push these plants into a territory of hydraulic failure. And that's true whether you're living in a relatively dry or wet system. So all sorts of plants are susceptible to hydraulic failure, even if they're not living in a particularly dry environment. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that one big ecological impact of drought is these mass mortality events, and these can really kick off transformation, especially when they happen to a long-lived woody species like a tree, because large mature trees just don't die very often. And so when a bunch of them die at once, you get a pretty immediate consequence for ecosystem structure and function. And so mass mortality events in trees have gotten a lot of attention, rightfully so. But we also want to think about what happens after mortality events and think about when systems might be able to recover from that big event. And the simple answer is that when species have high recruitment, they can recover from even a pretty severe die-off. Although when it comes to really slow growing and long-lived species like an oak tree, that recovery might take a really long time. But we don't want to confuse a long recovery for transformation. Instead, what we're talking about with transformation is situations where recruitment rates are so low that they don't compensate for mortality. And in those cases, we get declining population growth rates that continue after drought and could potentially lead to transformation. So what's important is that every species in an ecosystem is going through this process. And when species differ in these different rates, we can get shifts in species composition. Some of them will do better than others, and that could potentially lead to transformation in what that system looks like. So it's really both mortality and recruitment that are relevant, and you don't always need a big die-off to get transformation. If you have low recruitment over a long time period, that can lead to transformation, even without a mass mortality event. And that can be a little bit harder for people to notice. So the next thing we thought about is, what are cases where we might expect that recruitment would be limited after drought and possibly lead to transformation? And it turns out that there's quite a lot of factors that could continue to limit recruitment long after drought ends, which is going to prevent recovery. I'm just going to walk through a few examples. The first is that after drought kills off mature individuals, like mature tree species, we often see a loss of canopy cover. So a lot of systems, including both forested and grassland ecosystems, they become more open after a drought. And that often amplifies the effects of drought, where it remains hotter and drier after a drought because of more solar radiation, more evaporation. And so that inhibits the recruitment of new individuals and prevents recovery. So in these pinyon pine systems where many mature pinyon pines have died off, it's really hard for young pinyon pines to recruit because it's just too sunny and dry. So a lot of recent work is showing that the climate is just no longer suitable for recruitment. And this is especially true for a lot of the dominant species in mountain systems in the Western US. So I'm showing work here by Kim Davis and others that shows that the years where the climate is suitable for lodgepole pine recruitment, so it needs to be kind of below this maximum surface temperature, those years are getting fewer and far between. And so these are systems that are probably going to be shifting anyways. If lodgepole pine can't successfully recruit, they're going to eventually probably disappear from these locations. But what drought is doing is it's really accelerating the pace of that transition by killing off mature individuals, after which we just don't see any recruitment. Sometimes recovery is inhibited because another species has taken hold. And this was true of a lot of the case studies we looked at. So for instance, drought can be a window of opportunity for invaders. And after they establish, they might continue to suppress whatever native species were previously dominant. And that's something we see in a lot of grassland and woodland systems, particularly with invasive grasses. They're really good at kind of getting in there after a drought, and they can totally transform what an ecosystem looks like. And then last, recovery can be limited by other disturbances. Those could be fires, they could be other extreme weather events, and of course, they could be additional droughts. And so, for example, in the Amazon, after a drought in the early 2000s, there was this reduction in forest canopy, and you can see that recovery is really not happening very quickly. And in fact, the next drought came before that system had a chance to fully recover. And you can imagine as these droughts come faster and faster, you just might see this slow stepwise decline in whatever ecological characteristic you're measuring. So all of these factors mean that even after a drought is over, some systems are just not going to be able to recover. And many of these drivers, including novel climate conditions, biotic interactions, other disturbances like fire, these are becoming more likely and more severe. So it's clear that population growth rates are really shaped by drought. And in a lot of cases, those differences in population growth are going to continue to be reinforced long after a drought ends. And basically, some species are going to come out on top and others are going to decline. And that leads to changes in the composition of a community. So this figure is showing the number of species that were winners following the 2015 California drought. So these are species that increased in abundance across a few different taxonomic categories, and losers are those that decreased in abundance. So what's clear here is that not every species is going to decline from drought, but really we should think of drought as reshaping the composition of who's there. And what we really want to know is how this plays out across time, across the next few decades. And that's where we enter into some more unknown scientific territory, because understanding how species compositions change across time and whether they stabilize is a really tricky question. And it turns out it often involves a high degree of stochasticity. So it can be really difficult to predict. And I'll just illustrate this by highlighting an example from the Great Lakes region at the southern end of the boreal forest. And so in this ecosystem, we know that coniferous species, they're often going to be the kind of losers of a drought event. They're pretty susceptible to drought stress and the way that drought is manifesting in this region. And so a lot of folks have predicted that this boreal forest is probably not going to remain in its present state for much longer. But what we know less about is what it's actually going to turn into. So some of these coniferous forests seem to be transitioning towards deciduous forest, and others look more like they're turning into a prairie, which are obviously very different and require very different management strategies. So we've got a few different trajectories that could happen after drought in this system, and they might depend on the severity of the drought. They might depend on management history, what species are nearby, landscape context. All of those things might determine what this ecosystem is going to turn into. And we also might envision a scenario where a system appears to be on one trajectory, but something like maybe another disturbance, another drought, a management intervention, that redirects the trajectory towards a different state. And so questions about what these trajectories look like and how we identify them and how they respond to management intervention are some of the biggest questions that we had after doing this synthesis. And unfortunately, we might need to face the reality that we may never be able to fully predict these trajectories, or at least we might not be able to do it quickly enough to be relevant for decision making. And there are some frameworks that are being developed to try and address this challenge of how do we predict the future. And one of these approaches is scenario planning. And if you've been to previous NCCAST webinars, you might have already encountered this idea. But the idea is that instead of trying to predict exactly what an ecosystem is going to look like after the next drought event, you instead envision a suite of possible futures or plausible ecological trajectories. So we could take what we know about the traits of species in an ecosystem, what drought might look like in that location, and what other disturbances might be going on. And we can make some educated predictions about what could happen in order to prepare for a really broad range of possibilities. And so that requires integrating a lot of different types of science. And I'll just say that folks here at the CASC and at National Park Service are really working hard to develop strategies to craft these. And it's a pretty exciting way of thinking about how to combine what we already do know about drought, which is a whole lot, and not getting paralyzed with all the things that we don't know and can never know. So the last point that I want to make today is that when we look at all the potential ways that drought can lead to transformations, there's a lot of diversity. They're not all going to involve hydraulic failure. They're not all going to involve beetles or fire. And essentially that tells us that our strategies for dealing with transformational drought are also going to be really diverse. And drought adaptation is not just dealing with water. And I just want to highlight this resource that really runs through a ton of different drought adaptation strategies and what they're actually targeting in terms of process and how they might work in different ecosystems. And this slide really draws upon that excellent resource. So, preventing TEDs or mitigating the effects of these transformational droughts could involve, a lot of different tools. One that I want to highlight for the North Central region is grazing. I often think of the relationship between grazing and drought as drought impacts grassland productivity, and that changes how we manage grazing. So, drought impacts grazing. But of course, the opposite is really true. How we manage grazing really impacts ecosystem resilience to drought, often in a positive way. So, for example, reintroducing native grazers like bison has been shown to have some really strong impacts on ecosystem resilience to drought. So that's kind of a really interesting tool potentially for our grasslands here in the North Central region. And then I also want to highlight another key part of the drought adaptation toolkit, which is information. So trying to develop better indicators of ecological drought impacts, in addition to trying to monitor for agricultural drought impacts. This is an area of super active research, and we're starting to develop some tools that help us sense the really early signs of ecosystem impacts and start to catch these transformations as they are just beginning. So lastly, I'll just mention that generally when the first reaction when we hear about ecological transformation is, how do we stop it? It's a really scary thing to think about in ecosystems that we work in and love. And so a lot of the strategies that I've mentioned, they have the intention of mitigating the impacts of drought or supporting recovery after drought. And so they kind of fall under this strategy of resisting transformation. But many of you have probably heard of this idea of the RAD framework, which says that we also have some other options when we think about transformation. We can think about accepting these trajectories and not trying to interfere. And that means we might be doing things like, monitoring to understand how transformation is unfolding. We might be trying to quantify and evaluate new ecosystem functions and services. And of course, that might entail working with people and stakeholders to understand what the consequences of allowing transformation to take place are. And then last, we could think about allowing some change to occur, but actively trying to direct systems to new states. So when it comes to drought, directing change might mean planting drought-resistant species or assisting their migration to new areas. And actually, droughts might be pretty important opportunities to think about directing ecological change, because there are times where new niches are opening up, ecosystems are kind of primed to change. You're already seeing differences in the dominant species. And so you could potentially think about droughts as opportunities for using this type of strategy. And I'll just end by saying, making these decisions is pretty challenging, and it's going to require us to understand a lot more about what the future looks like after transformation. And even though that seems pretty daunting, I think what this synthesis taught me is that we already have a ton of super great tools for this. We have trait databases, we've got remote sensing information, long-term monitoring data, and I think we can start answering these kinds of questions. And of course, it's going to require a whole lot more of this type of interdisciplinary science. So I want to thank all of you for listening, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Right. Thank you, Wen. That was a great presentation. Yeah, we have some questions submitted through the chat box, and I'll maybe start with those, and then we'll just open the floor. The first question is from Stephanie Prevost. I'm thinking it is difficult to try and separate the interrelated influence of temperature and drought. How does the study address this, since the focus is on drought being the change agent?
Yeah, I think they are super interrelated. And I think when we did this work, we had to really broaden our, or at least for me, not being a drought climatologist, I had to really broaden my definition of what drought is, as it's not just about dry soils, it's not just about a deficit in precipitation, but it's about a dry atmosphere. And so a hotter temperature is going to cause deficits in the water in the atmosphere, and that's still defined as a drought. And so, yeah, I guess the answer is both. Yes, these droughts are caused by temperature, and they're caused by deficits in water. They're kind of impossible to separate out.
And I think one of the novel droughts we identified in our paper is the hot drought. They're becoming more common. That's the next question or comment is by Jack Wilson, like trade-offs between competition and facilitation can at certain granularities control apparent responses to drivers such as drought. These processes may mitigate drought effects beyond what otherwise would be expected, creating quasi-stable states.
Yeah, we talk about this a little bit in our paper. I didn't get into it today, but one of, I think, the most interesting patterns that I saw in reviewing the literature, and other people have written about this, is drought actually changing the nature of species interactions. So changing an interaction that used to be a competitive interaction into one that's a mutualistic interaction. And so it gets even harder to kind of predict some of these impacts, because you might think of these two species as competitors, but drought actually totally changes the direction of that relationship. I don't know if that answers this comment at all, but I think it's biotic interactions and how species are interacting with one another is a really big part of this equation, and one that is often pretty difficult to study and predict.
And just see another comment by Stephen Miller, like ecological drought versus physical drought, lots of rain, but still ecological stress. I don't know if you want to comment on that. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like wild to look at a map and see that precipitation is increasing, and yet we see increasing drought stress over time. And I think part of it is like, you can have more precipitation over the entire year, maybe, but it doesn't mean that there aren't going to be periods where you have really, really high drought stress, even if you saw mean annual precipitation increasing. So there's not only that, but yeah, it's also, it's not about necessarily the way that we would measure drought as a physical scientist, but it's about how drought actually manifests for an organism that's using water from the air or the soil.
Yeah. There's a question about, will the recording be available? Yes, the recording will be available pretty soon on our website. I see another question just appeared on our chat. Current drought indices fail to address seasonality. In the standard precipitation index, for example, a 90 or 180-day aggregation period doesn't account for seasonality. How do we do a better job of using drought monitoring to identify drought stress and potentially transformational drought?
I mean, I really want to punt this question to MTS, but I'll just say that, like, I think a lot of people are working on developing different drought indices that capture the biological response. So there's, indices that might be related to like sensing a response in greenness in an ecosystem that are using data as they roll in. And so I think we're getting better at like developing the right drought index for the right question, but it can be kind of overwhelming as a user to figure out which one is important to use. And I don't know, Imtiaz, if you want to add anything to that as a drought expert, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the point that, a value of a drought index across different seasons would mean very different things for the natural systems or the social ecological system. So that's a great point. And also, I think I just want to make a point on like SPIs. I mean, we're also questioning these days just the value of an index like SPI that just accounts for precipitation, just addressing the last question where the precipitation is just the supply side of the equation, and we need to integrate the demand side of the water balance into indices. And there are other indices that may be more relevant, but I'll stop there. The next question, from Jake again. Drought causes some systems to transform, but it doesn't cause all systems to transform. Do we know what causes the difference?
Yeah, I kind of thought we'd be able to answer that question after doing this synthesis, but it turns out it's pretty hard to answer that question. I do think like recovery dynamics are a huge part of it. If there's other stressors that are going on in a system that are going to add to the difficulty of recovering after a drought, I think that what can really tip the scales into something being transformational or not. I think there might be some amount of stochasticity. Like if a fire, I mean, that's not necessarily stochastic, but if a fire happens during a recovery period, that's going to have huge impacts on whether a system recovers or not. So I think it's a blend of like these ecosystem traits and these other events management history that aren't necessarily related to kind of ecological theory or ecological traits, but are more these extrinsic factors. And I think, one thing I would have loved to do if we stayed on this project is to start really cultivating like a database of these examples and really try to do some kind of meta-analysis that looks at, maybe tries to pair these transformations with a system that is similar, underwent drought and didn't transform, and start to really dig into that question. But I think it's just maybe the most important question to answer. And I think it's going to require a little bit more labor.
Thanks, Lynn. Lots more questions coming in. So maybe you can be a little more brief. One question from Joel Smith. We are seeing more flipping between extreme dry and wet conditions. Example, if atmospheric river hitting California when it's in the middle of mega drought. Can you comment on how flipping from extreme dry to extreme wet condition can affect transformations?
I don't know if I have a great answer for you, because I think that's an interesting question. We didn't really look at it in our paper, but I mean, one thing that can happen is that species can acclimate to a wet period, and that can actually make them more susceptible when it gets dry again. And so I think in some cases it could make the response to the subsequent drought stronger. I would imagine in other cases it temporarily relieves drought stress, but I don't have a great answer for that yet.
But yeah, that's definitely an issue in many parts of the country. From Kate, the next question: did your team explore or make recommendations for what statistical tools, workflows are most useful in determining the complex interactions and feedbacks that might lead to ecological transformations?
So no, we didn't really. And I think the next step for this project is maybe to try and turn this into like a risk assessment tool or a way of predicting the impacts of drought. And I'll just say that Imtiaz and a few other folks at the NCCASC are currently starting up a project to kind of try and get at this question of like how you might actually use statistical tools or analyses to start to predict the outcomes of these transformations. But I don't have an answer for you quite yet.
The next question is, do you see any trends related to life history-based susceptibility? Example, when the primary structural species have long generation times.
Yeah, I mean, I think something like that might be best answered with a meta-analysis or something, which we didn't do. But I will say, like, one thing we found is it was really hard to get an example of a grassland that underwent a transformation. I mean, we did find a few examples, but a grassland with like a lot of annual species, it does sort of seem like it's harder to push that towards a transformation, and maybe that has something to do with generation time, and obviously a mortality event in a tree species is going to take a way longer time to recover in terms of generation time. And so, that also leads to those systems having at least more obvious and faster transformations.
Maybe move to the next question. What is the spatial scale that your group focused on for transformation by drought? How large an area do you need? What to be considered for transformation?
Yeah, we didn't really explicitly set a spatial scale. It was just sort of, as we reviewed the literature based on what the authors determined was a transformation. But I would say, at least for me, I think I would think about this being relevant for like a management scale. So it might depend on what scale a typical manager is using, but there's definitely some heterogeneity where, part of a ecosystem might transform and other parts might stay the same. And those are super interesting examples to think about that question of like, what makes a system resilient is these kind of replicated areas where some transform quicker than others.
Yeah, and then moving from spatial scales to temporal scales, can you speak to drought time scales? I'm thinking of the National Park Service, who is tasked with preserving an area that may be in a very different drought condition than even a few hundred years ago. So I guess it's really talking about long-term trends.
Yeah. I don't know if this, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'll just say like, preserving, I think, is taking on a different meaning as we're already like working with systems that are transformed from what they were a few hundred years ago. I don't know if I have a great answer for that. I think we're seeing like, shifting baselines in what we're trying to preserve, and we're having to adjust like what our target is for preserving these ecosystems.
And if I may add, we really were thinking of drought at the time scales from really months to years, because droughts are episodic phenomena, but in the background we may be experiencing aridification, which is a long-term drying pattern. So both those time scales are relevant here, I guess, in terms of challenging the ecosystem. Okay, I'll move to the next question. Maybe this is one of our last questions. Can you recommend any tools for parsing out the impacts of temperature in terms of both intensity and duration? Drought assessment and monitoring doesn't spend a lot of time on when it comes to measuring temperature intensity and duration in terms of its impact on drought development and relative impact.
Yeah, I guess I will say that there are a lot of drought indices that in some way do incorporate temperature into the math of that drought index. So it is in kind of the way that we measure drought in a lot of ways. I don't know. I'm gonna keep this one to MTS too. I feel like drought indices are definitely not my area of expertise, I will say.
Yeah, and I think this temperature piece that's very much goes side by side with drought. Yeah, it's so difficult to parse out, but I think there are tools that just look at specific components of the climate system, like the atmospheric demand drought index. It just looks at the evaporative demand component that may have a stronger sensitivity to temperature as opposed to other drought indices. So, but yeah, I mean, I don't know of a pure temperature-based drought index, but temperature is so much inherent in drought response, the temperature response. I'm sure it's an inadequate answer. So we are at the hour. It's noon, and we'll just move into our informal discussion. So please feel free to stay around and ask more questions. But I really appreciate everybody's time in joining the webinar today, and I want to thank again our speaker for a great presentation. So take care, everyone, and see you next month.